Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you all for coming. I'm Maha Atal. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Public Business. We're one of the co-hosts tonight, along with the Columbia Journalism Review. This is a really interesting panel for us to be hosting because this question about public interest business journalism is really the reason that Public Business got started. I had the privilege with my business partner to be a student here in the school year that started in the fall of 2008 and ended in the spring of 2009 in a program that Columbia runs where you specialize in business journalism. 3 weeks into my course, the sort of heart of the financial crisis started. And at the same time, I was working a job at a magazine. And I think for that whole year, I was living a kind of cognitive dissonance between the sort of journalism that you aspire towards in this building, that is about holding powerful people to account, that is about giving the public power with knowledge, and the kind of journalism that we were practicing in newsrooms, which was really about trying to navigate chaos and not always being able to catch up. And I think this organization grew out of my business partner and I both feeling that the business press could do better. And so we spent, I think, a couple of months actually researching how we could do better, and what Public Business does is a direct response to that. And so briefly what we do is we invest in public interest business journalism by giving grants to reporters to go out and do investigative business stories. We invest in training journalists to do business journalism better by giving financial and economic literacy training to reporters. And we invest in events like this to improve public knowledge of topics in business. And so it's really special to be able to host and moderate a panel like this. So I am just going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then I think we're going to do an hour or so of discussion up here between the panelists, and then we'll open it out to questions from you. But if you have questions at any point during the event and you just absolutely have to ask or to follow up to something that a panelist is saying, if you look over on the whiteboard, there is a hashtag for the event. It's BizTrustFail. And if you just tag your question with that and you're on Twitter, I've got my phone here and I will try and put the question during the course of the event. So I will introduce the panelists one by one. And I'll just kind of go in order from your right to, no, your left to right or something. So Dean Starkman, who's sitting closest to me, edits the Audit, which is the business section of the Columbia Journalism Review. He is the magazine's Kingsford Capital Fellow, and he's a former Wall Street Journal reporter and was once the head of the Providence Journal's investigative team, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1994 for investigating corruption in Rhode Island's courts. With Felix Salmon, who's sitting in the purple jacket most of the way down. He's editing a book called Best Business Writing 2012, which is due out in May. He's also finishing his own book, which is called The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, The Financial Crisis and the Financial Press, and both of those are going to be published by the Columbia University Press.
Hopefully everyone else's bio will be shorter than the one I wrote for myself. Sorry about that.
Actually, no, some are longer, Dean, than the one you wrote for yourself, but some of them had to be cut a little bit. So I apologize. Okay, Jeff Horwitz is a former government reporter who realized 4 years ago that all good stories involve money, preferably lots of it. Before becoming a risk management editor at American Banker, he attended Columbia's MA business program, where he was in my class. He freelanced in Rwanda. He worked staff gigs at the Legal Times, the San Bernardino Sun, the Washington City paper. And before becoming a reporter, Jeff wants you to know that he supervised a home for schizophrenics. He shelved cat food on the Piggly Wiggly's graveyard shift and unloaded salmon boats in Naknek, Alaska. Suzanne Kapner, who's sitting in the middle, is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, where she covers banking issues and from the latest developments at Citigroup to financial cyber crimes. Before joining the Journal in August, Ms. Kapner worked for the Financial Times and Fortune magazine. She started her career in business journalism in 1996 at TheStreet.com. She moved to London in 2000 to cover mergers and acquisitions for the New York Times, and before returning to the finance beat in 2010, she spent 4 years writing about the fashion industry for the New York Post. Felix Salmon, who's sitting in the purple jacket, who I already pointed out, is the finance blogger at Reuters. He first started blogging, although it wasn't called that at the time, when he joined Bridge News in 1999 as Latin America editor. He would link to news stories on the wire, add snarky commentary, and do the whole thing on a fixed page in reverse chronological order. He started his own blog in 2000, and since then it's been hosted at Rabini Global Economics, at Portfolio, and since 2009 at Reuters. Felix grew up in London, studied the history of art and philosophy at Glasgow University, and learned the difference between a bond and a loan during a stint at Euromoney magazine. He moved to New York in 1997. And Larry Ingrassia has been the business and financial editor at the New York Times since January 2004. Before joining the Times, he had a long career at the Wall Street Journal, where he held a variety of reporting and editing positions. He was the winner of the 2009 Menard Editor Award, honoring excellence in business and economics journalism, one of the annual Gerald Loeb Awards. Ingrassia has helped direct coverage that won prestigious awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for the Journal in 2003 for coverage of corporate scandals, and Pulitzer Prize for coverage of September 11th, also at the Journal. At the Times, he oversaw coverage of the economic crisis that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2009. I think that where we should start is, I think most of you should have received when you walked in a copy of the Columbia Journalism Review, and if you didn't, you can pick one up when you come out. And that is an issue, I believe, from January that contains a really great piece by Dean about the distinction between reporting for investors and reporting for the general public, and the way in which, and Dean will kind of explain this argument a little bit, the business press has moved to report more for investors than the public at large. So I want to start by asking Dean to kind of summarize the argument that he makes in that piece, because I think that's a starting place for the discussion we're going to have.
Thanks, Maha. Actually, I was going to summarize it, but Felix has been imploring me to read the entire 5,000-word piece.
It would save me from having to have interesting questions to ask, so please.
Mainly because I haven't read it.
but I'm going to resist that. Thanks for everyone for coming and to the panelists, and I'm glad that we're here to have this discussion because I mean, one of the things that distinguishes the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 from our point of view is the degree to which it took everyone by surprise, or most people in the public anyway. My argument is going to be simple, and I did make prepared remarks, Felix, but only to keep things as concise as possible, because I just wanted to see if I can help frame this argument, because I think we're going to disagree along the way, but I want to see if we can figure out, a starting point. First, the piece just basically made a couple of fairly obvious points. One was that there are basically two kinds of business reporting. There's investor-oriented and public interest reporting. One deals with internal metrics like earnings and that type of thing. The other deals with external costs and social issues. One might be earnings versus pollution or predatory lending. The second point the piece makes is that sometimes these interests are not always in perfect alignment. In fact, sometimes they're often at odds, and the mortgage era was a perfect example. In 2006, Citigroup earned $21 billion net income, which was one of the highest net incomes in the history of public companies. Fortune, sorry to pick on Fortune, but they in 2007 wrote a piece that criticized Chuck Prince and saying he was in trouble because of their less than stellar earnings, because the year before, 2005, the earnings had been $25 billion. So it shows you sort of the reality distortion field that can take effect if you're only looking at investor-oriented concerns. Investors could only be euphoric at Citigroup's performance during the mortgage era, and yet we know that a lot of things they were doing did great social harm. I would argue, and I argue in this piece, that the business press has not only not resolved this tension, I don't think it's even acknowledged it. I think as a journalism subculture, it kind of takes, it kind of moves through the day going about its business, kind of assuming everything is more or less for the general good, when in fact that may not necessarily be the case. So that's why I'm kind of glad we're having this discussion. The other couple of things that I think worth pointing out was that business news, began, this was a very pragmatic tool. It was an investor-oriented thing. The first business news, as Richard John, the great historian here at Columbia, would tell you, are things like price currents, like lists of prices that were, of commodities that were, available in Amsterdam and London in the 16th, 17th century. The early Dow Jones was basically a messenger services where young boys were running around Wall Street and Broad Street with pieces of paper about earnings. So the business press didn't really cover the financial system. It was sort of an extension of it. And I'm just sort of trying to say in this piece that it was, the public interest stuff came much later. It was kind of grafted on almost unnaturally in some ways after World War II, and this is basically due to, I think, largely due to one man named Barney Kilgore, the great Wall Street Journal editor and Dow Jones executive, who sort of conceived of the idea that business reporting could encompass larger things than just investor-oriented concerns. Okay, and I would just say that, and I think it's fair, but maybe Larry will disagree, but within newsrooms, this sort of tension, these two poles of investor-oriented public service reporting have been, sort of fighting it out ever since. And I would just argue, and as I do in this piece, that that these frames, they move. Sometimes one side wins and sometimes the other does. And I thought, and I can't say I proved it, but I argued that the 90s saw this kind of shift back toward investor-oriented concerns, and for good reason. In the 90s, this was the time when the U.S. middle class, in sort of mass numbers, in its most, the flowering of middle class stock investing occurred. In 1980, only 13% of the American public was invested in stocks in any way. 1999, half the country was. And the biggest shift occurred during the 90s when all sorts of new titles and came on like fast with these kind of market savvy, smart sounding names like Smart Money and Fast Company and TheStreet.com and all that. And to me, that there was this kind of shift toward this more investor oriented concerns, which I'm trying to argue in the book kind of came at the worst possible moment as the mortgage era was dawning in 2000, 2001. So anyway, we can argue about the adequacy of the pre-crisis financial coverage. I'm sure we will. I point out, or at least I tried to in a piece in 2009 called Power Problem, that I thought my reading of that era's coverage was that what we saw was actually quite a bit of good stuff, business coverage, but it almost uniformly fell into a couple of categories. Either investor kind of oriented stories about the housing bubble, which was amply, no matter what anyone tells you, the business press was on that, and it was that was amply covered and warned about. And also there were some very fine things about the defective nature of many of the mortgage products that were on the market. What you didn't see, I believe I showed, and maybe someone will run up to me with the story that I missed, but what you didn't see was a classic expose of a large financial institution, while it was still powerful, about its basic core business practices, the mortgage market and the aftermarket. And I think that's sort of the starting point for me. Now, there was this. I'm going to leave it there. There was but I would sort of plant this. The thing that kind of the thing that kind of crystallize this for some people, for me anyway, was that kind of interaction between Jon Stewart and Jim Cramer when they were picking on each other, and it was like almost like two, Cramer represents this a savvy investor and a very smart stockpicker and kind of classic financial journalist, and Stewart's sort of the general public, like what gives. And that exchange where Stewart kind of goes, it feels like a game that is going on, and then you go on TV as a financial network and pretend it isn't happening. And it was like kind of this interesting moment of two sides talking past each other, where Cramer was trying to explain what he does. He said, I pick stocks and I do the best I can. And Stewart was sort of taking that large approach and said, but we missed, I'm a layman and I didn't get what was happening. So that's sort of how that's how I sort of frame this question, and we'll see where it goes from there.
So I think one thing I want to follow up on, having read the piece, is that part of the core of what Dean is arguing is that there is a period in the kind of middle bit of the 20th century, where there was a lot of public interest business journalism taking place, and that we've pulled back from that. And so it is, to a certain extent, an argument about change over time. And I guess I want, Larry, who's spent a really long time in this business, to talk about whether that fits. Okay. Hey, that was carefully framed. Whether that fits with your experience, or if you have, kind of a different take.
Well, I would say, kind of three main points, and some of it's in disagreement, but some of it's in agreement with Dean. One, I actually think that business journalism is much better today, and there is much more accountability journalism in the business press in the past decade than there was 3 decades ago, kind of putting it in my time frame as opposed to 5 decades ago.
Right.
And I think anybody in this audience and kind of who's been reading the Times or the Journal will say there's a lot more kind of in-depth, hard-hitting journalism that questions the way that business is done than there was 3 decades ago. You just have a lot more sophisticated reporters. And I think there's no question about that. And the second thing I would say is that I don't think it's an either-or, and I think that Dean thinks it's an either-or, that you can, that either, you're writing investor or you're writing public interest journalism. And I think that we do a lot of both, and I think that we serve the public by doing both, actually. And I'll just kind of give one example, kind of Apple, which is, kind of one of the most important companies in America. I remember, one of Dean's colleagues at the Audit, kind of writing a couple years ago, why is the press covering all these new products coming out from Apple? I mean, oh my God, is that crazy or what? And I was like, actually a lot of our readers are interested in these new products. That doesn't stop the New York Times from doing a series, which we're doing now, about Apple and how it operates in the economy and the globalized economy and what that means, the I-economy. You can do both, and I think both serves readers very well. There is one area where, kind of Dean, kind of hit on, I think, a little bit tangentially in his piece that I think actually the business press, but I would even say the press could have, should have, needs to do a better job on, and that is the intersection of government and business and regulation. Because a lot of the problems that we look at now, kind of whether it's, kind of in the world of finance, but not just in the world of finance, kind of in energy exploration, whatever. I mean, it is the confluence of regulation and business that I don't think any of us fully recognized how important that was. Companies began lobbying very heavily in Washington in all sorts of areas, including financial, to kind of push regulation in a way that they could operate in the way they want to. I think that it behooves us, we weren't paying as much attention to that as we should have, and it behooves us to pay even more attention to that in the future, because that's where the rubber meets the road. In so many different industries, not just the financial industry. But again, this is not just a matter of the business press. I mean, I think it's the broad press. If you're a Washington reporter, what do you want to cover? You want to cover politics, okay? What do you want to cover in politics? You don't want to cover policy. You want to cover the presidential campaign. It's the horse race that matters. Well, actually, the horse race is kind of interesting and fun, and it's important, and the candidates are important. But, kind of what's going on in Washington at the agencies, what's going on, kind of in the hearings at the SEC that not enough journalists attend and report on. Those are the things that actually set the stage for a lot of the issues that kind of we're seeing. And so, on that score, I think that a lot of us have learned in the past few years that this is something that, kind of it behooves us to not say, oh, my eyes glaze over, the reader's eyes glaze over. We have to find ways to, kind of penetrate that, bring it to life, show why it matters.
Does anybody in the panel want to jump in on that? Otherwise, I can ask a follow-up.
How do you want to do it? You want to?
No. If you have stuff to say, you should. You were nodding, Dean, so that's why I'm asking.
Okay, I want to jump in
Yep.
on this question of public interest and what Dean was saying about how he wished there had been some hard-hitting investigation of big evil banks which had revealed how big and evil they were before the crisis.
Yes, exactly. Yes, actually.
And you know, there's a lot of different ways you can respond to that. One of which is, you know, to sort of say that you need, you know, the things which they were doing which were wrong were very deep down in the weeds of various relatively boring mortgage bits and that kind of thing, which is one of the reasons that people like Jeff are the people who are really uncovering some of the most interesting stuff in business journalism right now. You kind of need to be a trade reporter to have those sources and to be able to understand what's going on and to be able to be talking to those bankers for periods of months or years to understand it and to uncover what's happening there. But much more broadly, I think, and much more importantly, the public simply didn't care. One of my favorite stories about this is that there was this incredible scoop which this guy called Nick Dunbar had in 2003. He was a very smart trade reporter who'd been covering this for a very long time, and he uncovered this very shady deal that Goldman Sachs was doing in Greece. And they'd done this crazy cross-currency swap, this like bizarre derivatives trade, which was incredibly harmful to Greece on a fiscal perspective, but it didn't show up officially on the Eurostat books as Greek debt, and so it allowed Greece to officially adhere to the Maastricht rules on debt to GDP ratios. And he wrote this piece for Risk, and it caused, I think it's fair to say, absolutely no consequences whatsoever. This was, you know, this was a huge story a year ago when Der Spiegel, bless him, you know, found an old back copy of Risk magazine and basically copy and pasted the whole article. Now that Goldman Sachs was the big evil, you know, vampire squid, and they splashed it all over, you know, Spiegel, and the finance ministry in Europe and Eurostat started getting very embarrassed, and everyone loved the idea that they could blame Goldman Sachs for the fact that Greece was, you know, had so much debt, which of course you really couldn't. But the, you know, but just reporting this stuff doesn't help if it doesn't catch some kind of a sort of public desire for, you know, justice. If they don't want to blame that organization, you know, you could, you know, the stuff, for instance, that Henry Blodgett wound up getting prosecuted for in the wake of the financial crash. If you'd been reporting it during the dot-com boom, no one would have blinked an eye. You know, it would have been like, oh yeah, that's what financial analysts do. It's all part of the course. And then suddenly, when you know, people lose lots of money in the stock market and they're, you know, reaching out for someone to blame, then suddenly it's big and evil, and this guy should be barred from the securities industry, and he has to blah 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 blah. Right? So you know, there's a reason why these things only come out after crashes. There's a reason why the journalism comes out after, you know, the 2000 stock market crash, after the 2008 financial crisis, because at that point we want someone to blame. If you do the journalism beforehand, no one cares.
Okay. Well, as long as we do.
No,
permission.
You don't need to ask my permission.
Okay, here's the thing. I mean, here's the thing. I feel like that's wrong. Here's the thing. Look, I divide this mortgage, you know, the whole crisis into two pieces, as the mortgage market and the aftermarket. And Felix is talking about the aftermarket, and that's, you know, I think the point's quite valid. But, you know, actually, if you actually do trace the history of reporting in the mortgage business, starting in the early 90s, every time the press did do exposés, there were actually reforms were enacted. You can go back to Boston Globe doing these exposés of this outfit called Fleet Financial, now part of Bank of America, which was doing predatory lending all over the South, particularly in Atlanta. That was picked up by the Atlanta Constitution and Journal. I think Mike Hudson wrote something in Washington. You know, 60 Minutes did something, and next thing you know, you have HOPA, Homeowners Equity Protection Act. This was the first anti-predatory lending law in the 90s. You could trace it all the way through. I mean, the Times did a piece in 2000, the great piece by Diana Henriquez and
in our audience tonight.
Oh, yeah, it was an amazing piece. Yeah, and Lowell Bergman, and that, as you know, also was about Citigroup and the acquisition. No.
Lehman.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an amazing piece. That was and the result was, I mean, I don't know if it was the result, but you can't, it's not necessarily tracing, cause and effect, but, it kind of creates this context for reform. In that case, the exorable subprime lender, his name escapes me. Thank you, closed. And Lehman got into, deep kimchi with the shareholder suit, et cetera. You could continue. I mean, Mike Hudson did stuff in the LA Times on AmeriQuest that got them in hot water. They closed. The fact is, the thing we kind of need to acknowledge is actually press can be actually quite potent. I think that needs to be at least acknowledged. That's what I'm saying.
So as someone from a publication where we wrote extensively about standards in the mortgage industry for, say, a decade before the crisis, just because that's what we do. We have a mortgage section. We have to. We did, as it turns out, I went back through our archives to look at this. I wasn't there at the time, but we did get a lot of things right. We had a lot of, Jody Shen from Bloomberg, who used to work for us, wrote a lot of stories wondering why exactly it was that documents were no longer necessary to get loans. And they were skeptical. They were not aggressive. They didn't say, these loans will go bad, just give them 5 years and a minor tank in the housing market. But they were very, very good. And I don't know that the world was really ready to, on a larger level, was ready to grab those. In the same way that I suspect if I'd told you 5 years ago that I had a really interesting story about how rating agencies were rating pieces of mortgage bonds that were rebundled into other mortgage bonds and then re-rating them and possibly bundling them again, that you would be asleep by now, and of course we've just described a CDO.
Right. I mean,
I'm going to jump in with a question here. But so I think part of the question is who was reading American Banker when she was writing those stories? Because I think one of the things that happens right after the crisis is that people who don't otherwise read American Banker, who don't otherwise read the business section of the New York Times, are opening it.
That would be nobody, but because everybody reads the business section of the New York Times. I'm not sure about the American Banker.
Of course, Larry.
Yes, sir.
Well, the American Banker, everyone reads that.
Nobody doesn't read. Yeah, right.
But this is also true. If you want genuine public interest journalism, if you want to interest the public, you don't put it in the business section because the business section is the first section which they throw away on the way.
Plenty of our stories run on the front page.
That's right.
Exactly, you put it on the front page, and then they might read it on a good day with the following wind if they don't.
Continue it on page B15, and that's how you get them in the business section. Anyway, go on, Felix.
Who? Me?
No, I mean, just this point about the audience and mission are not the same thing, right? So you can be doing public interest journalism and not be getting it to the general public if it's not in the right place. I think that's a question we should address.
I mean, what I'd ask Dean, I mean, do you see them mutually exclusive, that
No.
There's only one good kind of journalism, that you shouldn't write about Apple products?
No, of course not. Of course not. And I think you may have your paraphrase of Ryan's piece maybe missed a little nuance, but no, of course.
Best is yours.
But but what I am saying is this: is that no, of course it's not either or. Not only that, I mean, I love deal stories. I love doing M&A. This is great. I mean, it's, I don't even think there's a moral difference between, it's not a question of one being better than the other, but I do know that, there is this, and there's this constant tension, and sometimes one side wins. And I also say that the investor-oriented news always will have the advantage, as it should. I mean, that's the main job of business news, to serve investors and stuff. The other piece has always been this minority report that always needs to be kind of shored up because it's pretty easy to crowd out. My only point there.
I mean, as a journalist, I don't think I'm writing the story for investors or I'm writing the story for the public. I just want to write good stories, and sometimes I'll write a story that really is more, geared to investors, but I'll get calls from the general public about it and vice versa. So I think sometimes, you just never know what's going to catch people's attention, and you want to focus on writing interesting, newsworthy stories that inform people how the world works. Sometimes there'll be public interest, sometimes there'll be M&A, investor-driven, and there's no, I don't think it's so black and white.
I think I want to put a question to the panel here. I think it's probably a good time, especially because I'm getting tweets in on this point, to define what public interest and investor interest are. And so I'm getting a lot of questions around whether public interest is basically advocacy journalism. We should talk about whether that's what we mean. And also, who is an investor? And I think that's a question that we should probably address, because I think who was an investor 30 years ago is very different from who is an investor now. In some way or shape or form, probably everybody in this room is an investor. And so I think if somebody wants to speak to both of those, before we go further, we should define our terms.
In terms of who is an investor, it's facile and kind of pointless to say, oh, we're all investors, we all have pensions, and this kind of crap. Because, as far as investor-focused journalism is concerned, that is journalism aimed at what you might call buy-side individuals and institutions, people who are buying stocks and bonds because they have some kind of a strategy of, I'll buy this one rather than that one because I think it's going to go up, I'm going to sell it and do, rinse and repeat. Outperform, all of this kind of crap, right? You need to be essentially a professional or semi-professional active investor for investor-focused journalism to be remotely interesting to you. And that's a tiny minority of the US population.
It's also not particularly useful. I've never actually tried this, but my bet would be that if I sat with like an E-Trade account sitting open and in my pajamas watching CNBC and Fox Business, I would lose a lot of money really, really quickly. And that's, actually my dad, late in his life, moved on to being a professional value investor, wrote a newsletter, did very well, returned 10% a year over a decade. As best I can tell, he did not make those numbers up. That sort of research is drawn heavily from reading the news, but there's never actionable information in it. I think generally if you're a journalist and you're thinking that you are providing actionable information to a reader, you're probably doing them a very great disservice. One, because if you've got 10,000 readers, only the first 10 of them are going to get the trade in, and two, because probably your advice isn't very good. I wouldn't even think of trying.
Journalists love to believe that asset prices move on news. Every time you read a stock market report, it'll always say, this index did that and that index did this on, after this happened or that happened. And they invent causality every single day. And 99% of the time it's bullshit, and there's absolutely no connection between the news and what stocks did. And we just can't bring ourselves to admit that, in fact, news does not drive stocks. And so, because we control the media, by definition, journalists control the media, we love to sort of perpetuate this myth. And so we talk about the idea that there's this horrible concept, as Jeff says, of market-moving news, and especially if you work for a place like Reuters, like I do, oh my God, we love market-moving news, and we'll tell all of our clients, we had this move, and then the stock moved, and then it's really, really horrible, gruesome, nasty stuff, and we sell this myth to investors, to stockbrokers, to individuals, to even pretty sophisticated hedge funds, saying you need to have this news because it's really important and it moves the market. And you do wind up disappearing down a vortex of uselessness that way.
Also, your readers, if they are going to trade on things, are going to get front-run by Dow Jones algorithms that basically take the pertinent numbers out of every economic release and immediately send them to the highest bidder. This is, you will never compete with that.
Look, and in fact, the most sophisticated hedge funds, they use news feeds as contrarian, indicators. Every time someone writes something good, they're like, sell.
Mickey Drexler, the former CEO of Gap, once told me he doesn't like to do magazine covers because anytime he ends up on the cover of a magazine, you know, the company's bound to do badly afterwards. So there's a contrarian indicator.
The magazine cover indicator is a famous thing.
Can I
Yeah.
defend Dean for a second?
What?
Please.
Yes.
That would be interesting.
You know, again, if I kind of get back to, I think there are lots of different types of journalism that are valued to the public. So when I think of public interest journalism, I think a lot of different things. But yes, accountability journalism is very important, and we need to take that mission, you know, kind of as one of our top missions, if not the top mission. I think if you're saying that, then I think that is something that I don't think a lot of people would. I don't think a lot of people would disagree with.
Oh, I think a lot of people who would. I mean, if you're the New York Times, yes, but like in journalism in general.
Okay, but can we do a better job of that? Yes, and do we need to? Yes, it doesn't mean to the detriment of the other things, and that's where probably I would disagree. You know, there was an interesting editorial in the Wall Street Journal, my former employer, the other day, where, and I'll just kind of read a quote from it, which I thought was a very interesting. What Americans seem to want most from government these days is equal treatment. They increasingly realize, and this gets back to my point, that powerful government nearly always helps the powerful. And this is something why we have to very much focus on, you know, kind of regulations and how regulations are tipping scales. You know, what are people worried about? I think people are worried about their jobs, you know, kind of, and part of our job is to explain the economy in the world that's going on. And a big thing that is missing here is that I think, Dean, and you can talk about financial journalism, and, you know, kind of the financial crisis, but there are a lot of, you know, kind of globalization is changing our world in a lot of ways, and, you know, kind of we need to write and explain that. There's not a right or a wrong there, and there's not, you know, kind of who's to blame or who's not to blame. But a lot of what's going on, you know, kind of we can write about it. It's not necessarily going to change these major forces that are changing the world. But, you know, kind of it's our job to try to explain them. And so I do agree with you that and that's holding, you know, kind of government trade policies or government, you know, kind of policies that affect imports and exports. I mean, those are important things. They can be a bit dull, but those are important things for us to cover. And I put that in the public interest.
Me too. I mean, in fact, you know, during 2010, you know, it was difficult. Times is an exception, I grant, but, you know, it was difficult to find stories about unemployment, even though it was up in the, you know, high single digits.
We did a series that
about
the new poor,
and that's
kind of raised the question about whether there was a certain underclass.
No, understood, and that's what that's invaluable, and you would be probably the first one to acknowledge that doesn't pop up out of a toaster. Somebody has to do it. You know, somebody has to actually make a commitment to do that, and in fact, it's not.
But there's a tension over that. When you say that there's tension in newsroom, I don't think there's tension over it. We consider that part of our mission.
Understood.
We consider the day in, day out coverage of the economy and companies as part of our mission.
Got it. But, you know, I just want to just step back a little bit and so, you know, why are we here? You know, and we're here.
It's the fee for me.
The fee, and there's drinks.
You guys aren't getting paid.
But you know, we had this event that set the developed countries back literally 10 years in their GDP and foreclosures all over the place and all that. And when you go back and look at how we, and I mean that as a collective, we covered Wall Street, there is this strange disconnect, you know, when these headlines I pulled out from the era, but they kind of recall they recall a different, like almost a different reality. You know, these ones I like to cite, but, you know, putting the muscle back in the bull. Stan O'Neill may be the toughest, some say the most ruthless CEO in America. Merrill Lynch couldn't be luckier to have him, you know, Fortune 2004. Rewiring Chuck Prince. Citi's chief hasn't just stepped out of Sandy Weill's shadow. He stepped out on his own as he strives to make himself a leader with vision. Business Week 2005. You know, there's something up there. And you could make a laundry list of these, but it's not the point.
I'll tell you what's up there. This is exactly what I was saying. This is what, hedge funds read, and they use it as contrarian indicators. There's nothing new about that.
I'm not saying it's new or old. I'm just saying it reflected nothing of the radicalization of the financial industry that was undergoing at that very time. It had nothing to do with either the boiler rooms that were set up in strip malls for making mortgages, or the uses those mortgages were put to in the aftermarket. So all I'm saying is,
but you're not seeing headlines like that anymore.
Right.
Okay, this is where I really want Suzanne to step in, because Suzanne has a really kind of interesting career path in terms of reporting on finance, and in the most maybe investor-oriented piece of it, which is deal reporting and M&A reporting before the crisis, and then coming back to it afterwards. And I wonder if you can give us a kind of before and after. How is it different to be working this beat now? How do you think about it differently? How do you do it differently? How is your audience different now than it was before?
Well, I think the story's different more than anything else, and. There was, covering M&A is sort of a special kind of beast, and, you do sort of it's hard when you're reporting the news of the moment to step back and take a critical look at how a merger is going to play out. And, I think as journalists, we need to do more of that, not just break the news of the moment, but, also kind of take longer term looks at, especially at mergers, since a lot of them don't work out very well. I think that journalism has become much more critical today as a result. That's maybe a good thing that's come out of the crisis. And you see, just looking at some of the stories our reporters have written recently about the Federal Reserve and how they've been working in secrecy to make a lot of rules, even as other regulators have had to vote publicly about things, about this hedge funds getting insider access to some Fed decisions. And so I would argue that that's a really good thing that's come out of the crisis, is that I think you'd be hard pressed to find publications today that are defenders of the banks or defenders of government. There's a lot more critical journalism out there.
On M&A.
Yes,
sure.
yes, we can. We have mics. I think they are on.
Let's open it up for sure.
You're welcome to step up to the microphones. I think we turned those on before.
I think I can make my
Okay,
voice heard.
fair enough.
I'm Aaron Candell, and I go back in this business even longer than Larry.
He can tell you 50 years ago.
Longer than Larry.
The fact is,
Wow.
every one of the panelists have discussed great journalism that's been done during this period of crisis. What they have overlooked, however, is that great stories were not followed up. For example, Diana Enriquez wrote that marvelous award-winning series on predatory sales of mutual funds to service people. Won all kinds of awards. She should have won a Pulitzer, but she didn't. Okay? Why didn't the New York Times then, and this is not a criticism of you, Larry, but why didn't the New York Times then go to every other reporter and say, what kind of predatory practices are going on in your field, that this is not an isolated situation? And the fact that companies were giving loans to people who didn't deserve them, subprime loans and so on. So we can all, and Dean has done it, we can all point to great stories that were done by Fortune, by the Times, by the Journal, by Forbes, you name them. Everyone has done a good story, but they didn't follow up, and they didn't say that the banker did too. They didn't say that this is a subject that needs continual attention, and maybe if they had done that, we would have avoided some of the problems.
Larry, do you want to speak to that? I know he said it's not about you, but I think it's probably a question you should feel.
Mike, could we all have done more, better journalism? I think that you have a certain number of reporters, and you're covering a lot of stuff, and I can point every year to investigative accountability journalism that we did, taking different targets. Last year we took a look at David Kochanevsky took a look at Times took a look at taxes and corporate taxes and who pays what. You know, we took a deep look at fracking, and you know, kind of whether, and you know, you can't, you know, kind of, you've got to allocate your staff, and you got limited resources to do things. But you know, could we have all, and can we all do better? Yeah. But each year, I can tell you, at the beginning of each year, we set an agenda, and we say, you know, kind of, we want to have, you know, kind of just in the business section, you know, kind of, we want to have 3, 4, 5, 6 ambitious projects going, and then beyond that, you know, kind of the paper, you know, does too. So, you know, kind of there is a concerted effort to look at it.
I think that there's also an institutional constraint why these kind of things don't happen. The greatest series, like Diana's, are generally journalist-driven. You know, they're sort of found by the journalist, you know, who's generally a very sort of dogged reporter with a very interest in it, a very, you know, deep interest in it, who goes after it and goes after it and eventually finds the story, you know, rather than some grand Larry Ingrassia figure sitting on high going, I think we need to investigate this. Why don't you all go and investigate things and we'll find the great story.
I do that too.
And then, and then, you know, and then, of course, once that story is out, every other publication in the world is sitting there going, oh, well, that New York Times has already done that, so we can't do it because we'd just be copying it. So that the idea, and this is why one of the reasons why I'm a big booster
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
You know, blogosphere, because the blogosphere is the exact opposite of that. You know, once someone latches onto it, everyone else latches onto it, and it grows all over the place. And it's kind of the opposite to this competitive mindset that you get in the mainstream media.
Also, there's an element of response too. I mean, continual drum beating. Just say, you know, for me as a particular reporter, if I write about something, I think I do a very good story on something, and no one notices, maybe I'll 6 months later come back at it and check for new developments. But I'm not going to write the same story a week and a half later. And to be fair, that's kind of appropriate. That's sort of, I think that's kind of readers and everyone else weighing in on their judgment, suggesting that what I thought was a really important story was actually kind of stupid and pedestrian.
Yeah, but I you know, kind of, I think Mike asked an interesting question, saying kind of, okay, look, you know, you said that there were some questionable practices here, you know, kind of, everybody should be thinking about that. And everybody should be thinking about that. Not everybody is as good as a reporter as Diana Henriquez.
Well, there you go.
True fact.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. The question I have is, you know, Larry spoke about regulations, and in the financial services sector, as regards investors, there is a bifurcated system where, you know, institutional investors don't receive all the information they are supposed to receive for them to be able to make informed decisions. And then you have another category of investors, relatively less educated, less savvy, and they get all the information that, you know, that they need not necessarily understand. So what kinds of, you know, and I do think that, you know, regulations are de rigueur in this regard to, you know, make the system more streamlined and balanced. Do you think the business press is actually doing enough reporting to address problems and concerns faced by investors? Thank you.
That's for me.
That's for whoever wants it, I think. But Jeff looks like he wants to jump in, so go ahead.
I would say that that is something where everyone tends to fall flat in their face in terms of the quality of information presented and how it's presented. I would suspect it would not be a surprise to anyone on this panel, actually, that the quality of trustee reports for every mortgage bond and collateralized bond, you know, credit card collateralizations, is absolute garbage. These things look like they were filled in by, you know, a drunk third grader, if that drunk third grader had a very good computer. But I mean, the quality of information is very, very poor. It's hugely damaging to investors, and it's been that way for years, and I think we all know about it. It's very hard to write about, however, and it's the same thing sort of with some of the larger regulatory questions as well, is writing about Basel does not go down easy.
There's also an unbelievably annoying bias in the business press generally towards stocks and away from everything else. So, you know, what Jeff is talking about is, you know, the bond market is much bigger than the stock market, but no one seems to realize this. And no one really covers it in remotely the same amount of sort of detail or breathlessness. And that's where you find a lot of the biggest and most egregious things which are just not being covered because they don't have a ticker symbol.
Well, that's because stocks are good stories. I mean,
Right.
they're companies that are doing specific things.
Literally they're stories. That's the thing.
Yeah.
They have a narrative associated with them. And it's so much easier to tell a story when there's a built-in narrative like there is with a stock, as opposed to, well, here's a bond. It pays the same amount of interest every 6 months. And then
Until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't. Yeah.
I think the challenge is, when you ask about that kind of writing for individual investors and trying to, first of all, I don't think they would read that and stuff and necessarily understand it. I think the bigger mission, and I think kind of where Dean has put his finger on something, is to write, in a sophisticated way that holds powerful institutions, whether they're governments, kind of quasi-government or companies, accountable and kind of put them under the microscope. And then you can, kind of affect change. Again, we did a series 2 or 3 years ago about some of the practices of the banks with regard to credit cards and debit cards, and kind of that they were, there were overdraft fees of $35 a pop every time you kind of bought a cup of coffee if you were in overdraft. And oh, by the way, they actually rearranged kind of on a daily basis the overdraft, kind of when they charged something, kind of that was coming out of your account, so that they could maximize that. And that actually had impact. Now, if you had written about this, if you'd written to, I think, to an individual and say, oh, you ought to be aware of this, it doesn't have the same impact as saying, hey, companies are doing this. And that did affect change. And kind of, again, I think there's a breakdown in regulation. So regulators stepped in and said, kind of, oh, we're not going to allow this. Kind of, they now have limited that. Well, they have to some extent.
Congress stepped in. I mean,
yes,
the regulators refused to step in, and then it eventually wound up being addressed in Dodd-Frank.
And that's where I think our efforts can best be focused, as far as, kind of looking, kind of what institutions do and what regulators and, kind of elected officials do to, try to protect the public. Because in the end, the public has a hard time protecting itself. Especially when we come to financial products. These aren't that sophisticated. Regulators and elected officials, part of their job is to kind of to create a good environment for business, because that's all good for us, but also it's part of their job to protect the public. And that's what we can do. So are they doing their job? And we can do our job better. Are they doing their job to protect the public?
So I have a follow-up to that, which is, in the newsrooms in which I have been, there is not a lot, if any, real kind of overlap between the people who are covering the regulators and covering Washington and the people who are covering the companies. And I suppose if everybody could kind of speak to that.
Everyone in the business press right now is highly aware of that. I mean, that's something which isn't going to be fixed overnight, but I don't know of a single organization which doesn't have, isn't putting a huge amount of effort into trying to weave the regulatory reporters in Washington into the business reporters in New York.
Right. I have a question also for you, Felix, going back to something that you said earlier about, the problem with follow-up journalism being that news organizations are afraid of copying one another, and the way in which the blogosphere is changing that. And I suppose that opens up a whole set of questions about the way in which, the internet is changing journalism and how that's affecting what we do. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit, because in addition to writing about finance, I know you write extensively about what's happening to the media as an industry.
So how the internet is changing journalism, you've got 30 seconds.
No, how the internet is changing business journalism, really, right? So that gives you, I don't know, 5 minutes.
Give 40 seconds for that one.
Yeah.
I think the most exciting thing, I mean, obviously I can talk about this for about 8 hours, but the single most exciting thing which I think that can be done and is being done to some extent and should be done much more is the way that primary sources are being put online and annotated, and you can read them directly, rather than having to just read a newspaper article saying a report out from such and such an organization said that why. You can actually post the report, and you can and the readers can read the report, and there's a lot of people out there, it turns out, who are smart enough and interested enough to really want to read that report, and just putting those reports up there, and then if you're doing a big investigative piece, ProPublica is fantastic at this. You know, they'll put up thousands and thousands of pages of documents and say, look here, look here, look here. The New York Times has a sort of, I don't know what you call it, joint venture or something with, what's that company called? I can't remember.
Neither do I.
But yes, so they've found a great like annotation tool as well, which they use for this purpose. And because there aren't any space constraints anymore, and because so much journalism is really just about uncovering original documents, the fact that all of those documents can now be placed online for everyone to see is just revolutionary, and I can't wait for it to happen more and more.
Well, I want to dissent from that.
Good.
Because I can.
Before you go, Dean.
Yes.
You know, Diana's come up. I want more people to come up to the mic. If you have questions now, is just go ahead and start lining up. There's that one on that side should also be on. We'll call on you in turn. Anyway,
I was just going to say, I would just suggest that that there's an element there of totally true that that there are that these resources are now available, but the question is who's using them and who are these readers. And I would suggest that we're talking about a kind of a form of elite communication and not necessarily mass communication. So whereas specialists and some people can get into can do the deep dive, and there's nothing, that's a good thing. I would suggest it's the original piece by ProPublica that actually is the thing that's sort of driving the conversation.
You can actually, no, I disagree. I mean, I really want to hear what Diana has to say, but you have to, also what the internet can do is it can completely expand the concept of what journalism is. And you can get a judgment by Jed Rakoff, which in and of itself is just a fantastic read. It's a fantastic piece of journalism. It uncovers amazing stuff. He expresses himself amazingly clearly. And then you get some poor Harry beat reporter who's, this 30-page judgment lands on their desk, and you're like, okay, here, write it up in 800 words, and it's never going to be as good. And you're always better off just putting that document out there.
Well, I mean, sometimes it's going to be better, but sometimes it's not going to be as good.
Diana, go ahead.
Yes, I defy you to decipher Judge Rakoff's recent rulings in the Mets case, by the way, in the Madoff matter. I think what I'm fundamentally troubled by, although I find myself in great agreement with Dean in many ways, is this discernment that there is a business press and there is the press. And we're going to hold the business press responsible for tackling issues of public interest and engaging the non-investor citizen with these issues. I think Larry was exactly right when he said that intersection between what happens in the back halls and undercovered agencies in Washington is critically important, but that's a political story. It concerns me that we have sort of ghettoized business journalism and given it these vast responsibilities for reaching beyond our natural borders, when in fact what has happened is that business has escaped its natural borders and invaded every other beat at our news organizations. And that's what we haven't responded to. We don't require our political, a case in point, now I have not watched every Republican debate. My husband did.
If anybody in this room has, they should raise their hand right now, because you can have a drink from me.
He's recovering nicely, I'm happy to tell you. He watched every one with this instruction from me. Notice what they say about investor protection. We're still waiting. We are past Super Tuesday, and the only time financial regulation has come up is in the debate, I think in Atlanta, I did watch that one, where the proposal was to not only repeal Dodd-Frank, but to repeal Sarbanes-Oxley too, for good measure. That's all that has been mentioned on the campaign trail.
And one of the reasons for this is that while I will boost the internet and say that in many ways it's better than print newspapers, there is absolutely no doubt that when it comes to the kind of journalism we're talking about here, print newspapers are 80,000 leagues better than the way that most Americans still get their news, which is television. And remember that television is the medium which is in charge of the debates.
Well, all I would like to suggest is, as big a fan as I am of Dean's, is that you're preaching to the choir, Dean.
Right.
You're preaching to people who already believe that financial and business and economic developments are critical to the way the world unfolds for everybody. The people who need to hear that lesson are the people who are covering politics and environment and culture and science and foreign affairs, and that requires some fluency in those economic and business issues. We can't do our jobs. We don't cover Congress from the business section. Somebody else does. So I'm just suggesting that we widen the burden here beyond the business press.
I'm going to open this to the audience, but I want to say one thing that our training program looks to do when we invest in training is actually to do financial and economic literacy for all journalists, not just people who work in the business press, because I think that's absolutely true.
Before we
And
do
include
that,
those television journalists, please, because they're the worst. They really are.
Is there anybody in here from a broadcast news organization? You should come up
Especially
and
CNBC.
before we do that, there's something else that I think, for me, is something I always grapple with, and I think might help explain some of the difficulties. It's that to really get familiar with a subject matter, you generally have to spend a lot of time dealing with the people who are expert in it. And at least in terms of the financial stuff, most of those people are in major banks. It can be done outside of those channels by talking to the people who either represent small banks, thank God those are in our reader base because they're really helpful, or other ways. But it's, for the most part, it seems to me like developing the necessary technical expertise can sometimes involve compromising already. And I guess, at least that's how I have tended to look at it. And so I'd like to ask actually one of my panelists here, Suzanne, how sort of she approached doing M&A stuff, which is about as insider as it gets, and whether you would have ever been able to, and perhaps you have, really suggest that particular firms were engaging in terrible deals and that the bankers were perhaps putting together firms that made no sense whatsoever, if that would have basically ruined your ability to write on that beat.
Well, I know Dean's dying to jump in, so I'll make this quick, but.
No, take your time, please.
I'm still thinking about my.
Dean will be fine, don't accommodate him, go ahead, talk.
I got my licks in already.
You know, the nuts and bolts of how companies are valued, and that's hard, and that I would say a lot of journalists, including myself, when I started covering M&A, I mean, I didn't really understand that, and I learned a lot, luckily on the job, but I don't think we do enough of that, because I'm not a banker, and so, I'm struggling through these numbers, and sometimes you're, using your sources to help you understand them, and they have an agenda. So, that's definitely always a challenge when you're doing any kind of numbers in a story. It's very challenging to make sure, and you want to make sure you have the numbers right, because that will make your story. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of a story that depends on numbers. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, and it's definitely a challenge.
Just for my own, semi-answer my own question, which is kind of dumb. For sort of my own stuff, there are definitely topics that I tend to avoid because I truly can't find anyone outside of a bank that will not talk to me, that understands them. And for sort of things have gone quite well over the last few years for people who do not have big sources or who do not have major sources inside the large banks. It's kind of a free-for-all at the moment, but that doesn't work for all topics. And if anyone else has any ideas for how exactly you really get in to cover sort of back office banking operations, if the large banks will not talk to you, I'd be interested. And yes, I'm aware how stupid this sounds. You
go the classic blogosphere route. Is you don't try and answer all of your questions. You go, you start asking questions. You don't have answers. You're like, I have no idea what's going on here, and you put it out there, and people come to you. That's how, I mean, it doesn't always work, but it works a lot more than you might think.
I've just been thinking of this, Donna's good question about why the business press and why pick on us and not everyone, and I think that's fair. I would say though that it's a burden, it's also an opportunity, but it's also mostly a burden probably that because for better and worse, it's that thing that I categorize as business press is basically the only connection that the general public, lay people, would have to financial institutions and their regulators. In other words, they're the ones who are best positioned as to translate and explain those peculiar and complicated, opaque, secretive, and often nasty institutions to the and essentially and basically no one else. So you could ask, you can't ask, the Metro desk editor, Charlotte Observer, to become literate in that. That's the problem. That's the great problem, actually, of the financial media, is that they're the only ones between the public and the institutions that.
But you can get the journalists.
You know what I'm saying? In other words.
More.
I do not buy that we have some kind of high priest power that enables us to interpret these things to the general public, when many of you have already acknowledged that if we put it in the business section, they won't.
Right, I understand.
That is absolutely right, and the fact is, all you need really is a collegial atmosphere where the people on the business desk talk to the people on the Metro desk, and amazingly,
things will happen.
No question. I mean, we're not really at odds as all that, and of course you have to bring, but
people want to ask questions. Let's just.
Yep,
yeah,
I know.
sorry.
I want to get to this gentleman who's been waiting quite a while. We'll go one and
Sorry.
one.
I think we were actually just with what Mr. Horwitz was headed towards. I think it's sort of what I was trying to want to bring up here. We've looked at the question of sort of audience for what we're writing or reporting on, and we've looked at the question of some of the quirky decisions that the business press people make. But I think that there's sort of a third issue. Let's look at the industry that we're covering, and I'd be interested to hear from the panel thoughts about. I mean, this is an industry, Wall Street in particular, that thrives on opacity. They make their money where there is no transparency, and we come up against this wall, I think, a lot of times. I work at Bloomberg Markets Magazine, Bloomberg News, so similar to the experience of an American banker, we're down in the nitty-gritty of this stuff, but watching the financial crisis having unfolded, we're writing stories now that would have been really relevant in 2008, but we're only just getting information now out of this crazy opaque thing that we cover. I'd be interested in hearing from the panel, what issues or what advice or ideas do you have, or what things have you come up against in terms of trying to crack open what is essentially an industry that thrives on being opaque?
You can't do it without subpoena power. It's so hard.
Do you have a subpoena power?
I mean, I use a lot of lawsuits, and obviously that is a rear-looking tool in the sense that first people have to lose all their money, and then they have to get pissed off, and then they have to sue people, and then I find out about it. And even that I consider to be like sort of cutting edge for what we do, if that makes sense.
And one of Bloomberg's biggest successes right now is a long, drawn-out Freedom of Information Act fight with the Fed about how much money they actually gave to the banks during the crisis. And so 3 years, 4 years later, we report it was a hell of a lot.
And they were desperate for it. Let me try to answer kind of on something that we might have done better, but also the limitations. there was this huge growth of kind of non-bank banks in the kind of first 5 years of the decade, which were pretty shady operators in the mortgage market. And they weren't big institutions that we normally were used to covering. And so we did not cover them as well as we could have. I mean, again, Diana's piece with Lehman and First Financial, First Line was a bit of an exception there, but they actually were very important, kind of players, and we could have probably exposed those practices better by focusing on that.
And
now, if I make the limitation, which is the financial crisis wasn't caused by bad subprime mortgages going into default. It was caused by CDS that was hidden, and nobody knew the extent to which, for example, AIG had credit default swaps. It was the bets that were able to kind of, you didn't have as much, kind of, if every subprime mortgage in the U.S. had gone bad, you wouldn't have gotten anywhere close to the losses needed to pull, kind of to threaten the financial system. But there were no data that actually showed it. So there were limitations on that. You could have written stories saying, oh, kind of, if this happens, CDS, kind of depending on how much out there. But there was very opaque the amount of data that was out there.
There's no question.
I disagree with that, but that we're getting way off.
Right. It's a whole other panel.
I'll fight with Larry about that one. It's
okay.
Well,
yeah. Let's do that.
We'll keep the panelists up here for a fight about that after. Eric, go ahead.
My question is reference to Dean's comment when he started the panel about Citibank. Right, there were two stories. Citibank year to year, made 22 billion, 25 billion the next year, and then the other story would have been, well, how did they make the money? So my question is like the journalism aspect of it, of sort of what's going on here. Like, what's the story? My mother, is a housekeeper in Jersey. Like, all she knows is rent's going up, paycheck isn't going as far. Like, I can read a 10K. I know what it is. I know what EBITDA is. My mom and her friends, they don't. So my question is, how do you decide to frame the story? Because what is the general interest? Is the interest, hey, look, companies are making a lot of money, or, hey, companies are making a lot of money by jacking up your fees because you don't know, and it targets lower income people, that sort of thing. So that's sort of, I guess that's what I like to address.
It's a great question, and the guy standing right behind you could answer it, Mike Hudson, who wrote, a piece in about Citi, and you couldn't call it anything but an expose in 2003. He won the Polk in 2004. And it was about Citigroup as a subprime leader, and all of and precisely how they made their money, and that's sort of the perfect example of the difference between one kind of reporting and the other. And look, I don't, I don't know if that. That's the the elixir, the magic bullet, but at least somebody publicly have a fighting chance to begin to understand where those mortgages came from that became RMBS, and they became CDOs, and then became the things that you bet CDS against that blew up the financial system. That's all I'm saying.
Also, what I want to get is, you as reporters, right? You get published, or you're on people read your blog, or they read your newsletter. You frame the story. You set, here's what I want you to look at. Because, I've got my own life. I'm doing my own stuff. I don't have time to do the research. I'm outsourcing that to you guys.
Yep.
So, how do you frame that story? How do you know okay, I've got all this research. This is going on. What's the story?
Understood.
I want to add a follow-up to that because I think
with hindsight, I think the answer to that is also the answer to Larry's question about the way in which the business press failed to interrogate the shadow banking system. And if you were asking serious questions about how, in the name of all that's holy, the Citibank managed to make $25 billion a year, the answer turns out to have been the insane amount of leverage that they had in their SIVs, and which really was responsible for a huge amount of the financial crisis and the massive bailouts that were necessary, because Citi was this massively leveraged institution, and it was all off balance sheet, and it was really hard to understand. And you know, that's where, if we fell down anywhere, that's where we fell down.
That's the next panel.
We didn't notice, you know, the SIVs at City.
Some of these things, though, were apparent. I have forgotten his name. This is embarrassing. He's the guy who led Morgan Stanley before John Mack. It begins with a P.
Purcell.
Thank you. Purcell was, this is the story of and I very rarely, I think this has been cited a few times. I'm not going to say it's never been said, but Purcell basically oversaw a fairly stodgy Morgan Stanley. He refused to go into crap businesses. He refused to lever up. He eventually was canned because, understandably, Morgan's board was not thrilled that Citi was making a ton of money and that Morgan Stanley was just sort of in the dumps. New York ran a magazine, feature on sort of his demise. The thesis of the magazine piece was that he'd been fired because he was an asshole. This is their wording. It's not, I wouldn't bring this to Columbia otherwise, but that was.
We don't use that.
That's a lie.
But that was, and in fact, quite clearly why he was fired in hindsight was because he had refused to lever up. And now John Mack came in, blew up their balance sheet by a factor of 2 or 3 over the course of a very short period of time, and somehow managed to survive being seen as a guy who had actually sort of shepherded Morgan through the crisis, when in fact the story is that he had his foot on the gas pedal heading toward a cliff, and unfortunately the car died before then. And that's, I think in terms of just even the executives, some of that stuff is off. Like John Thain, for example, the business press and everyone else went wild over his toilet, which turns out like it's not actually a crapper, it's something else, but that wasn't really the point from my point of view. From my point of view is that John Thain was kind of the most brilliant businessman ever in the sense that he'd taken a total disaster of a company and had managed to bluff Bank of America into paying a premium for it, and had then basically walked out doing exactly with money in his shareholders' pockets, which is best as I can tell what he was hired to do. So it's kind of like we all came in late and then got a very dirty hit on that guy, at least in my own.
I want to speak to this just because it's a question that came in a while ago and I haven't been able to get it in from an audience person, but we were talking earlier about, if the story runs in the business section and the public doesn't read it, if it's really nitty gritty, then it's boring, it's spinach, they don't want to read it. I think one of the reasons you get a lot of stories, like the way that we covered the CEOs who were exiting the banks at the height of the financial crisis, is because that's the way that you make the spinach interesting to people. And I think it's worth talking about whether we can do the explanatory piece of it and the kind of, you should be excited about this because it's important piece of reporting these stories better.
I can tell you that, in the wake of the crisis, I wrote an unbelievably wonky cover story for Wired magazine on something called the Gaussian copula function, which was incredibly popular. A lot of people loved it. And they managed to, and the cover line was the formula that killed Wall Street. There is absolutely no way, shape, or form that story could ever have got published, never mind on the cover, anywhere in Wired magazine, before the crisis. No one cared about the Gaussian copula function before the crisis. It's only when, you've got something meaty and you can have a narrative with like the rise and fall of this thing that it suddenly becomes a story.
Right, I understood that.
I think it's our job to make these things interesting. You talk about Basel III and it's boring, but it's going to affect the way banks lend money and the way they hold capital and the way they're able to lend money to the average person, and it's our job to be able to relay that. So I don't think you can just say it's boring and we're not going to write about it.
But it is so boring, even for someone who works at American Banker.
Questions?
Yes, I think we haven't taken one from this side.
Yes, to what Larry and Diana are saying, I think the key is these discrete articles, if you don't connect the dots, then A, they are not going to serve the public interest and they're not going to reach the regulators. I want to know why there aren't more Dylan Radigans, because in my opinion, he's the only guy, having been the devil himself, having been on the other side of the fence and having to atone, he is trying to be at the nexus of the dark markets, what is going on, why the regulators aren't doing anything, what the public needs to know about it, why the CEOs of the 6 big bastard banks sit on the Fed and give themselves trillions of dollars of free money. I don't understand why that's not being reported more generally. So I think he's at least trying to integrate this and, you know, make it something that the public and the policymakers can understand. Can't more people do that?
Felix will probably have more on this, but my sense is that most of those guys like being bloggers more than they like working for a stodgy old newspaper organization.
Don't get me started on the subject of Dylan Ratigan, please.
Yeah, I mean, Felix had a reaction to that, so you should comment.
It would really help if you know, he knew what he was talking about as well.
But in terms of the, so setting aside Dylan Ratigan, in terms of people who have industry expertise,
yes.
Those people don't tend to come work for newspapers. And why is that?
Well,
and why do they like blogs so much? Because they do like blogs.
Yeah, no, I think that's to a certain extent true. I think that, you know, people like Larry bringing Stephen Davidoff into Dealbook and that kind of thing are opening up ways of bringing these people into the mainstream media too. I think a lot of them have day jobs. You know, the fact is the people who know this stuff are often the people doing it, and they're bankers, they're lawyers, they're making lots of money, and they can say what they need to say on the blog without having to give up their day jobs.
I mean, and there's a difference between reporting and ranting. You know,
frankly, they're both
difference between reporting and commentary, no question.
Yeah, I mean,
but informed ranting
you know,
is
kind
kind
of
of
actually
the best of both
reporting
worlds.
is harder.
Yeah, it's more valuable too, in my view.
Okay, I'm going to say now we're going to take the 3 questions that are standing, but the panelists will stick around for a little bit if you have other questions afterwards.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of take issue with this idea that we're often stuck because all the experts are in the big banks, and I don't think that's true. That's true for the very complicated stuff like credit default swaps and that kind of thing. That is true. But for the mortgage end of it, which was a big part of it, it didn't cause the financial crisis, but it certainly, you know, there would have been a mortgage crisis without financial crisis. And it also was an example. It was a case study in how what Wall Street was doing, and had we had better coverage of the mortgage practices back in 2003, 2004, 2005, it might have led to more questions. Well, if Citibank is doing this in this space, what are they doing in other spaces? But there are folks, when Diana Enriquez did her Lehman Brothers First Alliance story, correct me if I'm wrong on this, this wasn't coming from talking to experts at Lehman Brothers or some other big bank. It was, you mine the public record, you talk to consumers, you talk to at least one whistleblower, you talk to state attorneys general, and took what was a lot of sort of legal cases that were sort of spread out all around the country and pulled them together and wrote a fantastic story. When Scott Record and I wrote about AmeriQuest mortgage in early 2005, which was the largest subprime lender, held 20% of the market, and was in bed with basically every single major Wall Street firm. You know, gave them a warehouse line of credit. You know, we just called ex-employees. They were the experts because they knew what was going on. We ended up talking to 30 ex-employees who talked about, and you know, this was not boring stuff. This was people forging elderly bars' signatures on loan documents, cutting and pasting loan documents. In some branches, they would call it the art department. Oh, we'll do that. We'll take one name from, we'll cut and paste our bar's name onto somebody else's W-2 tax form to increase their income. You know, they're snorting cocaine in the cubicles. They're going out and drinking Cristal. And these are 23-year-old kids. That's a great human story. And the same thing with Countrywide. There were people who were filing whistleblower lawsuits in 2004, 2005, saying that I was fired because I reported fraud or I refused instructions from supervisors to commit fraud. If someone had reported those stories at that time and also followed up and said, well, there's 1 or 2 cases, are there more? Can we find other ex-employees? There are people out there, at least on that end of it, there were consumer advocates, there were state attorneys general, there were experts at various consumer organizations, and there were real people. There were ex-employees, and a lot of these places like AmeriQuest and And Countrywide, I mean, their turnover in their sales staff was like 70% a year. So there were lots of people out on the street. Some of them may have gone on to work at other places, but a lot of people were had moved to other places. And I had so many people when I would call them and say, I've been wanting to tell somebody this. I've been waiting, So those people are out there waiting to talk about these practices. And yes, you want to talk to the big experts. Yes, you want to talk to the big banks and press them and try and get answers. But there are other ways to get at it. Sometimes you have to start at the bottom and work your way up.
Sort of expanding the idea of the universe of sources. Right.
Does somebody want to speak to that?
I think that's totally right for that sort of stuff, and it's why, honestly, with a government reporting background, mortgages and consumer banking are, they're just ripe. There's a lot of people involved, and it's a question of sort of weaseling your way in, whereas it's very hard to do that, I think, for for shadow banking, for example. Those guys don't lose their jobs and start hanging out in the street waiting for someone to talk to them.
I understand, but there were people that were outside experts who knew about the amount of leverage, who were questioning that often didn't get talked to.
The best reporters find unconventional sources.
Right.
Yeah.
Leslie?
So I think to build on that, I can't say it better than what's already been said, but I think there certainly are ways of approaching people who work in industry in ways that I would say is probably similar to what a political reporter or a police or a beat reporter does to cultivate a source, to get to know someone in their habitat, in their milieu. I know Kevin Roos at the New York Times certainly writes from a more sociological bent, but does a lot of groundwork to get close to people who are in banking and work in financial services. I think there's probably a lot of people who work in that industry and either want to rant or have a guilty conscience and want someone to be able to at least give a sense of, here's something I know is going on. Maybe I don't have all the dots to break your story, but I can put you on to something that's interesting. And that won't cover everything. Some things do need a Freedom of Information Act or real forensic accounting, but there's certainly a ample way to sniff out clues by just approaching the human angle, I think.
I guess I was talking more about areas where the forensic accounting won't do it for you because you don't have any access to those things. But I certainly wouldn't want to disagree that talking to people who are sort of on the margins of the industry is where most of the best stories are coming from.
Right. I mean, it's also like what story you decide to do. I mean, is it about, the bank strategy for growth, and that's going to lead you to a certain number of stories, or wow, how's this bank making its money? That would lead to, I don't think it's making money in ways that are kosher. That'll lead you to different set of sources and different sets of techniques for getting them to talk, obviously.
Richard.
Thanks, Maha. I'm Richard Mahoney. I'm a longtime PR guy. We never get the last word on anything, so I'm really helpful.
Well, these guys are going to get the last word. But
I guess what strikes me about this conversation is that you could have had almost this identical conversation roughly 10 years ago, 2002, after the collapse of the technology bubble. We had we had the wreckage of Enron and WorldCom. We had the SEC looking really bad. You had some early warning reports in the press that sounded the alarms about some of those institutions. I guess my question for the panel is, and I think you're old enough to live through that part of our history, what things changed in a news organization in the aftermath of that crisis that you think worked or helped, or for that matter, were still failed us in terms of the crisis that was to erupt just a few years later?
Does somebody want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say
I
would probably take issue a little bit with the premise. I mean, the tech bubble was a different animal. We've had three big crashes since
different in terms of the impact, right, was less in the overall economy.
Yeah, but also
you had dodgy off-balance sheet vehicles.
True, that's true. I agree. That's sort of yeah. I guess the mortgage. Understood. The mortgage bubble to me is unique in the sense that this encompassed, not only just vast sectors of the civilian population of the country, but in ways that were sort of fundamental to their personal wealth in their house. Whereas that was sort of a classic business case where stock investors were duped. And this seemed to be much more sort of malign and damaging. So I don't know, I guess your point is that that would lead to, that should have led to a higher degree of skepticism, particularly about the balance sheets of large institutions, and I guess
we had such a bigger crisis in such a short period of time after
yeah, it is perplexing. I agree. I don't really have an answer.
Well, on that note, I think I'm going to just
thank
everyone.
Let's end.
It is perplexing. I think
let's end with
that's the
Dean
note.
says, "I don't know."
No. Is that a first? On that note, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'm going to be a little bit shameless here. You know, we did this event for free for all of you guys, and we try to do as many of these as we can. And to keep doing the work that we do, it would be great if people could contribute, and I am happy to talk further afterwards to anybody who's interested in getting involved in what we do. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, Maha.
Thank you.